Hey. Thank you. Hey, everyone. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm Mike Neuder. I work at the Ethereum Foundation, and today I'll be giving a talk called A Set-Theoretic View of Ethereum Coteries, which sounds fancier than it is, but yeah, let's get started. Cool. Quick outline of what I'm hoping to talk about today. First, I'll start by kind of setting the stage with some notational things. This will be the most boring part of the presentation. But then I'll go through 3 sets of 4 cases, and I call them base, extended, and specific. The point of the base cases is kind of to set the stage for the extended and specific cases, so I'll go relatively quickly through those, and hopefully we can spend time on the latter 8 cases. Cool. So just quickly, so we're all on the same page, I'm going to be talking about these different sets of people. Sets are kind of like these different participants in the Ethereum network. They're users, stakers, holders. We'll kind of go through them one by one. And when we talk about the relation between these sets, we use a few different pieces of notation that will come up in the following slides. So the double greater than sign would imply that A is a much larger set than B. The rest of the notation kind of is more standard. Greater than or equal to B is the same. Greater than or simply greater than B, and then the approximately equal to B would be sets A and B are about the same size or relatively similar. And then 2 last pieces would be the for all notation and the in notation. So don't worry too much. This is mostly a visual presentation, but I thought this would be a good place to start. Cool. So let's jump into the first of our 12 cases. This is what I call balanced. And now we're introduced to our cast of characters. First, we have our users. So this would be people who interact with the Ethereum or L2 ecosystem. They might be buying NFTs. They might be using DeFi. Holders are people who hold significant amount of ETH. I kind of differentiate them from users because they might hold ETH beyond what they just need to use to pay for gas. Stakers are people who participate in the consensus layer. So we have this kind of further subdivision into node operators, which I have 3 of in this kind of simple case: node operator 1, node operator 2, and node operator 3, and the solo stakers, which I represent here. So in this kind of base case, we have a situation where the user base is much larger than the holder base. The holder base is much larger than stakers. So this means that a relatively, or like less than a majority of the ETH supply is staked, which we have today. We have about 23% of ETH staked. And each node operator is kind of relatively equal in size and not controlling a majority of the total stake. So this is kind of the best case we could hope for. And there's kind of good distinction between each of these groups. And we have the most decentralized version of this kind of naive model. So now we can kind of adjust some of these relations and see what comes out. This is case number 2, which I call winner take most staking market. And here we have the same relationship between users and holders and stakers. The only difference here is that a single node operator, which is represented by this big circle here, kind of controls maybe a majority, maybe a supermajority of the staked ETH. So this is obviously a worse case than the decentralized one because we don't want a single node operator to run maybe 50 or 66% of the validators, but we still have a situation where the ETH supply is much larger than the amount of ETH that's actually staked. So, you know, in the worst case scenario, there's still some amount of ETH that isn't in the consensus layer and can still be used and potentially used to combat any attack that this single node operator might try and launch on the network. Case number 3, most of the supply is staked, but we have more operators. So this is kind of the inverse of the previous case, where now users is still much greater than the holders set, but the stakers, the staker set is almost the same size as holders. And what this means is that almost all of the ETH supply is staked. It'll never get to 100% because people still need ETH to pay for gas, for transactions, But you could imagine a world where like 90% or 90+% of the ETH supply is staked. And I think in that world, it would be much harder to go from that amount of staked ETH and to a smaller amount of the total supply staked. So that's kind of a negative in those terms, but we do have better distribution among the different node operators. So this is kind of differing from the previous case in that node operator 1, 2, and 3 are all kind of closer to the same size rather than one of them dominating the others. Cool. This is the last of our base cases, and it's most of the supply is staked and the winner-take-most staking market. So this is kind of combining the two elements of the previous two cases so that most of the supply is staked and most of the stake is controlled by a single node operator. So this is kind of potentially a worse outcome because now not only does one node operator control an outsized influence in the consensus layer, but they also control potentially a majority of the ETH supply. So like those two pieces combined, I would say are a worse outcome than either of them individually. Cool. So that was our 4 base cases. Now we'll go to what I call extended cases. And they're extended because they kind of focus on some of the more nuances of the protocol without diving into specifics, which are the last 4 cases. So case 5 is kind of highlighting the difference between a centralized staking protocol and a decentralized staking protocol and a centralized staking provider. So in this hypothetical world, we have our set of stakers, and there's 2 centralized exchanges, CEXA and CEXB. We still have our solo stakers, and then there's a pool A. And you could imagine that this pool might be composed of many different node operators. And so even though kind of at a high level, it looks like these 3 entities have similar influence over the protocol, the centralized exchanges have kind of obviously more influence because they're composed of a single entity running the nodes rather than decomposed into many different node operators. So this is kind of one of the nuances of the Lido debate is do you view it as a single entity controlled by the DAO, or do you view it as 30 different entities, across different jurisdictions? And this tries to capture some of that nuance. Case 6 is the relationship between minimal viable issuance and solo staking. I'll mostly refer the interested reader to this tweet thread for a discussion on minimal viable issuance, but the idea here is that up until this point, we've always said that the solo staker set was non-empty. So solo stakers exist and they meaningfully contribute to Ethereum censorship resistance and decentralization. But there could be a world where the stakers is composed of different node operators, but solo stakers basically can't compete. This could be because the economies of scale of joining a staking pool are so much higher than running a solo validator, or because the hardware requirements of kind of keeping up with the extra work that validator might need to do in a restaking protocol are simply like unattainable for the solo stakers. Case number 7 is a single app becoming systemically important and too big relative to other apps. So we have mostly been ignoring the user space up until this point, but you could imagine that this app, this kind of generic app, which I call app X, comes to represent a vast majority of Ethereum users in the ecosystem. And while the execution layer doesn't directly impact the consensus layer in that, like, if the smart contract gets hacked, there's no impact on the attestations or the fork choice rule, there still could be a situation where Ethereum is at risk because so many of the users were impacted by a single application. And there's a kind of still this single point of failure, even though it's farther removed from the actual staking layer. Cool, and this is the last of our extended cases, and it takes a quick look at restaking. So there is a world in which restakers come to represent most of the staking set as a whole. And this could potentially add another layer of centralizing pressure, especially if in order to compete on the restaking yield and in order to actually have expected positive return on your staking, you need to kind of increase the amount of hardware or bandwidth requirements of your machine. Again, this kind of circles back to the idea of potentially pricing out solo stakers by adding like levels to what it takes to be competitive and to be positive. So yeah, the point here is that restaking can morph the incentives of staking, and it also kind of adds a further layer of subdivision in this whole view. In order to like accurately evaluate the risks, we also need to consider the restaking risks too. Cool. So now we move on to the 4 example cases. I call them example because I'm talking specifically about individual projects. And the point of these examples isn't to point fingers or to accuse any projects of being malicious, but to show kind of how these kind of theoretical up until this point discussions could play out in terms of real projects. So the classic example of this is the DAO hack. The DAO, this is very similar to the previous case 7, which was an app becoming kind of too big to fail. So DAO users came to represent a huge proportion of the overall Ethereum users, and as a result, when the DAO was hacked, there was the decision to roll back the chain, which was necessary to avoid impacting almost all Ethereum users in the first place. The second one, which is, I guess, highly relevant for this crowd, is the potential for Lido dominance to kind of get beyond what is truly actually everyone is actually comfortable with. So everyone has a different number here, but I think we could all agree that if if Lido controlled 80 to 90% of all staked ETH, and that staked ETH represented 80 to 90% of the Ethereum supply, that could potentially be like huge systemic risk and way too much control for a single protocol in the Ethereum stack. So yeah, I kind of asked the question at the bottom here, which is what percentage is too much? Like the vote against self-limiting at 33% showed that 33% isn't too much, but is it 50%? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? I'd be interested and hopefully can discuss with some of you today after the talk. Yeah, case 11, Tyco becomes the hub for most users. So this, up until this point, we've kind of ignored L2 users, but you could imagine, based on the rollup-centric roadmap, that eventually the number of L2 users should hopefully exceed the number of L1 users. But this also kind of creates this weird relationship where even though the L2 uses the L1 for security, the L1 kind of depends on the L2 in order to like have value and to provide real-world impact for the users. So if an L2 far exceeds the user base of an L1, and then something happens on the L2 contract, or for whatever reason something goes wrong, how does the protocol react to that? Could that have systemic risk to the consensus layer? I think that's a question worth asking. And especially if one single L1 has an outsized influence over one single L2 has an outsized influence over the other L2s. I chose Tyco as the example here because everyone always chooses arbitrary optimism. So, cool. And this is the last case. Thanks for bearing with me through 12 cases. And this kind of takes a slightly different look at the same problem, which is up until this point we've thought about if a single project has too much control over a single entity or a single set in our model. But you could also think about if a single entity has control over many different sets, and even if it might not have a majority in any of those sets, the kind of centralizing force of having a large stake or a large influence over many of the subsets could also kind of call into question the true decentralization of the protocol. So I'm pointing, not pointing any fingers, but Coinbase is the kind of easiest example here. So at the staking layer, we have LS-ETH, which is the liquid staking ETH that's minted by the Alluvial and the Liquid Collective. We also have CB-ETH, which is Coinbase's liquid staking token. At the holder level, we have all the users that are onboarded through the Coinbase exchange. This is especially relevant in the US. In terms of stablecoin users, Coinbase is one of the most common on and off ramps for USDC. It's a place to mint and redeem. And they also have a very close relationship with Circle, the company that issues USDC. And then in terms of L2 users, Base has become one of the more popular L2s. It's a really common way for people to get first exposure into the crypto ecosystem, and it's done a great job of onboarding a lot of people. So I guess the question I want to leave you with in regards to this slide is, how do we consider decentralization kind of across the layers in addition to within a single layer of the stack? So that's all for me. My parting hope is that we keep Ethereum weird. Thank you very much.